Welcome, everyone. Those of you who are here in person, those of you who are still out in the hall, and welcome those of you who are joining us virtually. I appreciate you being here. I am going to be moderating this panel. My name is Erin Haacker. I am an assistant professor in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My research focuses on hydrologic modeling, hydrogeology, kind of that sphere, but I also work a lot with social scientists and ecologists and economists. And so I was at the last Platte Basin conference. How many of you were at the last Platte Basin conference? There's a good 3 of us. Yeah, it was a much smaller deal, and I felt like people needed to talk about groundwater more. And I was a postdoc at the time, and so I kept, raising my hand, so what about groundwater? And so when we planned this, I said, well, what about groundwater? And so I offered to run a panel, and it turns out we've been talking about groundwater all day long, which I find really exciting and really cool. I got to see Kristen Cognac talk about groundwater and wet meadows, so it's been great. And this is a panel. I'm going to ask a few questions just to help us get to know each other, but then I'll be monitoring the chat virtually, so nobody else needs to worry about keeping track on their phone. But the first thing I'm going to do is have each of our panelists introduce themselves, maybe a 30-second who you are, and then I'll start asking questions. But at any time, if anyone in the audience has a question, this is a very informal sort of thing. If you ask 3 questions, I will ask you to come up and join the panel. That's why we have extra chairs. So, yes, please, Doug, why don't you get us started?
Very good. My name is Doug Hallum. I'm a hydrogeologist for Conservation and Survey Division in the School of Natural Resources. I work out of the West Central Research and Extension Center in North Platte. My job is to investigate and to report on geological and water resources questions of Nebraska through research, service, and education and outreach. I like to kind of prioritize that service, so that service is directed by those that bring questions to my office, and that feeds into the research and education and outreach programs.
Well, I told these guys it's a little bit like the dating game sitting up here. So, my name's Amy. I like long walks. No. With all seriousness, Amy Harsch. I am the general manager for the Nebraska Water Balance Alliance. We are a grassroots organization that basically advocates for water rights in Nebraska, non-political. So I get to advocate, I guess, what I consider on the right side of the fence. So I get to have a pretty non-biased opinion. We do a lot of research and proving that truly we are not using nearly the water and we are more sustainable than truly what is led to be believed out there. Alongside of that, my husband and I do farm about halfway between here and Grand Island, where we also own our own irrigation management business. So I get to see both sides of that fence. I get to help, but I also get to see it firsthand. Actually was sitting in the auger wagon this morning with the combine picking corn. So doesn't get much more real than that in my world, and so we get to make a big impact firsthand on what's going on.
Afternoon. My name's Jesse Bradley. I'm Deputy Director at the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. My educational background is as a hydrogeologist like Doug. We used to work together as co-workers at the department. At the department, my role is to work with our water permitting group. We primarily permit surface water uses. Also work with our water administration group, so those are the folks out in the field working to investigate and look at water rights and make sure that they're being used under the conditions of their permits. Our water administration group is also the group that's responsible for operating over about 250 stream gauges across the state, so we do a lot of data collection and kind of interactive maps and pushing information out on natural resources. So that's under kind of our water administration group. And then the last group I work most closely with would be our water planning group. So that's going to be all of our basin planning, drought planning, integrated management planning in the state of Nebraska. And that's also going to include work on our interstate compacts and interstate agreements like the Platte River program.
All right. So I'm going to get us started with a very open-ended question, and this is for each of you. how do you think about groundwater when it comes to the Platte River system? So this could be its role or the challenges associated with it or perceptions associated with it. But when someone says groundwater in the Platte system, like what's the mental model that you bring to that? Just go in the same order that we did?
Sure. So my conception of that, and I don't necessarily think of it specifically in the Platte system. I think of it more in terms of the High Plains Aquifer. And I think of it a lot like this sheet of paper right here. And the High Plains Aquifer is a thin sheet of loosely to moderately aggregated particles that sits on an inclined plane, that is the Great Plains. And if we rained on this sheet of paper, it would eventually get saturated and water would move through it and eventually down that slope if we stopped the rain. We also have stream flow, or flow from up gradient, uphill, that flows onto this aquifer and off of that aquifer to the east and west. So if you have a little hesitation about my use of the word thin to describe the High Plains Aquifer, we know that it has up to 1,000 feet of saturated thickness. If I take and resize this sheet of paper to represent the High Plains Aquifer in Nebraska and the small part in the adjacent parts of Wyoming, this sheet of paper would be 800 feet thick. So that's my mental model. I think of it as a thin aggregate, a thin zone that water flows across, into, out of, and through.
So I'm going to have a really different take from that, not the non-scientific version of it. So from a grower's perspective, a farmer's perspective, the Platte River is our livelihood. We look to the headwaters in Colorado, we look to the headwaters in Wyoming of both the North and South Platte Rivers, and where they come in and converge into Lake Mac, and that's where our irrigation water comes from. And without the Platte River system, taken as a whole, not just what's here in Nebraska, but taken as a whole, that's where our irrigation water comes from. That's what we grow crops off of and what we're dependent upon as underground water systems. So a lot of what we farm, and I can speak firsthand to this, in this Platte River Valley is actually sub-irrigated. Old channels of the Platte River come through and actually water from the bottom up, which is really great because that helps us conserve irrigation water. So to us, it is a livelihood. It is a part of who we are every day. We pray over snowpack in the mountains every winter so that we have irrigation water in the spring and summer that hopefully will fold over into the late summer, early fall so that we have enough to finish crops out so that we can feed cattle, hogs, livestock in general, and put dinner on everybody's table tonight as we go home. So it's livelihood.
Yeah, I think the first word that always comes to mind for me when I think of groundwater is just connectivity, both kind of in the scientific sense and the way Doug was describing it, and more in the socioeconomic sense. I think that way Amy was describing it. That's what we do at the department. That's what we try to work on with our natural resource district partners across the state. We try to engage a variety of stakeholders in that conversation, and we all recognize the value that groundwater brings to this state, particularly our agriculture economy. So I think connectivity is one thing I point at, and it also makes it complicated. Understanding that connectivity between our surface water features, our aquifers, and having to manage that more on the scientific level, those create complications, and that's part I enjoy as well, but that makes it difficult too. I also think about sort of resiliency, and I think groundwater is a key component of the resiliency for our droughts. Think about return flow systems like we have on the North Platte River, where that surface water is entering the groundwater system and then coming back out and providing those kind of more consistent base flows. So I think groundwater obviously is critical across the entire Platte River Basin.
So is there anyone in the audience who's sitting here thinking, wow, I have a completely different conception of groundwater? Anybody wants to share? This is an informal session. Not yet. All right, we'll get you. You're wearing name tags. I can call on you, but okay, we're not there yet. Remember also that if you are shy, you can, or online, or both, you can ask questions via the app, right? Okay. So, all right. Yes. For the online people.
Okay. I thought of something, and it's really not in conflict with what was said by the panel, but I think the word that comes to mind is undervalued. I think we undervalue how important groundwater is in our state. What can we do about it?
That sounds like an interesting question for the panel. What do you think?
Well, the folks I talk to certainly don't undervalue it. That's an interesting perspective, I guess. I mean, I think, certainly from the state's perspective, we understand the value of groundwater and how critical it is, which is why, we invest thousands of hours every year to be out participating with stakeholders, working with NRDs, making sure we're developing partnerships for that management for the long term. So I think you're right, though, outside of maybe some of those stakeholders that are participating in those groups, there probably isn't a lot of recognition in some of our urban areas about how important that is, which is unfortunate. And hopefully with some of the newer water initiatives and kind of the focus on water in the legislature last session, hopefully people are starting to pay a little bit more attention to just the value of our water resources, which I think will also help in getting people to understand the value of groundwater as well.
Just as an example, a few years ago I bought a rural property, and I have a well on that property. And my static water level is 136 feet, so it's 136 feet down to the top of the groundwater table at my property. And not long after we bought the property, the power went out. And if you have a well and the power goes out, 136 feet doesn't sound like much, but when you contemplate when that power is going to come back on and your well not working, and you live in an area that I think I've gotten a half an inch of rain since June this year, the prospects for that water and the value of it changes in that instant of realization. And I think many of the people that I deal with, I'm in a service profession, so they bring those questions and challenges for me. And oftentimes when they're having a crisis like that, where they say, where's my water going to come from? So, and folks, the rural folks, or the folks in my part of the state, follow the news, and they I think they have a good bit of value, if only from that landowner perspective and understanding that that's one of the things that you can be without in an instant.
And I would agree. I don't know if it's maybe so much undervalued as underpromoted. We don't tell stories. We don't talk about what we do, how we do it, how we are sustainable, how we carry on the legacy for the next generation and the generations thereafter.
I wonder if there's also a nuance here, because for those of you who don't know Dan, his research focuses on water quality. And we have, by and large, been talking about water quantity. And if you pull up a well sample, barring turbidity, you may not be able to tell by looking at it whether that's a high quality or a low quality quantity of water that you've just accessed. And I wonder if that is coloring perceptions of how we're talking about the way we value water. It's more of a comment than a question.
Well, I would agree. So water quality, I live about halfway between here and Kearney, or Grand Island, excuse me, in the Central Platte Natural Resource District. Nitrates are high, all up and down this Platte River corridor. And so every well we have to test. Our house system has its own, denitrification system. Can't say that 5 times fast. So, you pull water out of the garden hose, it looks perfectly fine, but I know that it's probably above the standard limits and probably shouldn't be drinking out of the garden hose. So you go in the house where there's the filter system and it takes it out. But we have to be able to prove to the NRD every year that our wells are well within standards. So again, it's about telling that story. How many people in here knew that we have to pull those samples every year? So, it's an ongoing issue that as a grower we're faced with, and it's, being able to tell that story that farming's not easy. There's a lot of behind the scenes things that go on that nobody ever sees.
I just say that it's certainly true that you just simply can't tell for many of the water quality concerns that you might have. And I deal with lots of people individually, and there is a segment of people who, for whom ignorance is kind of bliss with respect to water quality. They don't want to know, they don't want to test, and that's a little bit of a hurdle. They insist our water is wonderful, it looks good, it smells good, we've been drinking it for 5 generations, therefore it is good. And many of these contaminants that Dan measures in his lab, you simply cannot know without testing. And that's a message I find myself talking with various individuals with repeatedly. It happens routinely.
Yes, Sarah. For the online people, I'm bringing the microphone to you.
So I have a very simple layman's question. What are the NRDs doing to try to prevent nitrate contamination of groundwater? Like, what is actually feasibly done and can be enforced to limit the amount of nitrates reaching the aquifer? And then once it's there, what do you do about it? Just hope that more water comes in the aquifer and reduces the concentration? Like, how is this problem addressed?
So I guess I'll kick this one off and just say that as a hydrogeologist moving out to the West Central Research and Extension Center, there's a pile of ag research that goes on out there that's dominantly what is done. And the people that look at irrigation and nutrient management for crops and whatnot are making huge strides in applying what's needed. And there are many different scales of research that are going on to address that issue. And that's something that really impressed me as a hydrogeologist. Now, there's contaminants in the vadose zone that's perhaps beyond the root zone, and that's kind of a separate question in terms of water quality. And flushing those contaminants can be a solution. Dilution with surface water can be a solution. In the worst instances, or if you're treating a small quantity supply like a household well, treatment can be an option, or getting a potable supply versus like a gray water supply. Those sorts of things can all be different solutions. And the solution really needs and ought to be tailored to the scale of the problem that we're trying to address, whether that's an individual household, a reach, an area, a township, sub-irrigated condition, table condition, or whatever. And there's a lot of research into that I was really impressed with and unaware of before I moved to North Platte.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add, we don't really do the water quality in our agency, but we obviously work closely with a lot of the NRDs. And, things that I see that they're doing is, they have a variety of every NRD usually establishes triggers. Those triggers kind of develop then enhanced levels of management. So maybe you go from a phase 1 to a phase 2 to phase 3. They'll enhance educational requirements for some of those producers. They'll start to limit application rates, make sure people are educated on what they're applying. You got to remember these are problems that developed over the long period of time, and I think they're trying to be very proactive, getting out there and having those triggers, having producers be engaged, being required to be engaged in those conversations, and then trying to leverage the science and what we're learning there in terms of implementing that through incentive programs and other actions at the NRD level. So I think there's a lot going on, a lot of practice going on out there across a variety of the NRDs right now.
So to just tag into both of those, from the grower's perspective, as I said, we send in water samples every year that have to meet certain thresholds. We can only apply chemicals during a certain time of the year to ensure that they do not leach. And as Jesse said, we're dealing with problems that have stemmed 50 to 70 years ago when farming was not sustainable like it is today. Hybrids of various crops have really transformed that we can grow more with less. So it's about targeting when we put on products onto those certain crops to grow at certain times to ensure that they get the most, can use it, and what is left, there is very, very minimal. So we are not leaching down through a profile. Do remember, growers really want to be sustainable. We drink the same water you do. We use it, our children grow up with it. So we truly want to be just as sustainable and are just as concerned about it as you are sitting out there.
Any brave audience members want to weigh in?
I just want, excuse me, I just wanted to say that chemicals cost money. And for a producer point, you don't want to spend any more money than you have to. And if those nitrates are already in the water, that's something you don't have to add as much of. So as you look at the water quality that you have on your land, and you adjust your chemicals to that load level.
All right, I'm going to go to the next question. How do you, but it's related, it's very much related. How do you see public perceptions of groundwater in the Platte Basin changing over the last few decades to years?
So I guess I'm going to, I don't know, is
okay.
really the
Fair.
short answer in terms of an overall trend. I deal mostly with individuals, and I find that in dealing with individuals, their concerns and their level of knowledge and their level of understanding or misunderstanding is unique to the individual. And you get to that through the dialogue. So I'm dealing with people a lot of times one-on-one or in very, very small numbers at a time. So I don't have a general sense. I think there is a segment of society that doesn't want to know, and as long as it's not a crisis or my well isn't running sort of thing, they would just as soon not know. Irrigators are acutely aware of their supplies. They're aware, as Amy mentioned, of their water quality. They use that in their nutrient management plans and things. So there are tiers and classes of people that vary, but I don't have a good sense of how those classes of people are growing or shrinking through time.
I tend to sort of agree, but maybe towards the more negative side of it. California has done Nebraska water no good. Unfortunately, there's a lot of controversy and politics over the water out there, which has flowed, no pun intended, to Nebraska and what we're faced with every day. I don't think, again, growers do a good enough story talking about what we do to be sustainable for our water long term. And I think that story is what they see in California is they're running out of water. They do not have enough water to just put down the pipes of the people that live in LA. What does that look like for us? Well, we're not in those dire straits, but there is concern, especially in these dry years, of how can we be more sustainable as a large consumer of the water to be able to long-term be able to have excess or a storage capacity that will sustain us for generations to come. We're using the High Plains Aquifer faster than we can replenish it, unfortunately. And so with that being said, part of what I get to do is that research on how can we start conserving that. People in Texas, they used to be able to irrigate whatever they wanted, however they wanted. Now they have pivots that sit out there that are dry, that have not pumped water in years. In some senses, the generation worth of not being pumped. So it is very concerning that that's moving north, and there's places in Kansas where they're running out of water. So we know that we have to be careful in what we do here, and we need to do a better job of telling our story and helping promote what we do so that negative connotation isn't always there.
No, I think that's a really good point. I think, too often folks read about what's going on in Kansas and Oklahoma, Texas, which is unfortunate, but they just immediately assume that those things are happening here in Nebraska, and that's just not true. And I think a lot of that goes to the foresight Nebraska had in terms of the management approach we took. We established NRDs 50 years ago this year. That's been a critical component of our water management, our groundwater management. I'd also say, while maybe it's not the broad public, certainly I think I'm going to come back to connectivity. I think when I started my career, almost 20 years ago at the department, we used to have debates, I guess, with NRDs and NRD board members about connectivity between groundwater and surface water. We didn't really have laws that fully embraced that until the early 2000s. But today we don't have those kind of debates, really. We just accept that there's connectivity. We've got to work together. It takes both of us to do our jobs working collaboratively to make this work. So I think that's been something I've certainly seen improve over the course of my career at the department. Just those relationships, working together, stakeholders coming into those processes and having productive conversations. So I think that's been a major improvement.
So that's a fantastic lead-in, actually, to the next question I wanted to ask, which is about the purpose of integrated management of surface water and groundwater, because a lot of this conference is about the ecology and the conservation side of water, and groundwater itself, when it's in the subsurface and not emerging as a spring or base flow, doesn't maybe contribute as much to, there's not quite as much stuff going on 130 feet below the ground surface. So this concept of managing everything as one water and integrated management. Starting with Jesse, can you tell us more about the purpose of integrated management of surface water and groundwater and how this is different from the past or from other places that might do things differently?
Yeah, sure. Like I said, about 2 decades ago, 2004 was when we really established some significant new laws in Nebraska, which, really for the first time in our history sort of put together our state agency along with NRDs as sort of true partners in managing groundwater and surface water as one resource. And so we do that through our integrated management planning efforts. Those happen at both sort of a basin scale and then within an individual NRDs. And if you're not familiar with NRDs in the state of Nebraska, we have 23 of those distributed across the state roughly on basin boundaries. So they're able to kind of adapt to the unique, physical setting, if you will, climate, topography, all those things that would kind of be unique to a given area, but also kind of at a scale that allows them to bring their resources to bear on issues if there are issues in those areas, and to kind of work collaboratively with the state on those challenges. But, I think in other areas, they don't necessarily have maybe as much flexibility as we do. I think of some of the other western states where things are managed in a strict priority type administration setting. Understand that prior appropriations is the law of the West as it relates to water typically, but it can really create suboptimal outcomes at a lot of times. So those can become a real challenge. I think in Nebraska, because we sort of have different legal doctrines for surface water and groundwater, that gives us more flexibility, and I think we're able to find some better solutions. I also know kind of when we talk about integrated management, this is also sort of the new academic buzzword as it relates to managing, kind of ecosystems, right? You're kind of managing all aspects of biodiversity, water, surface water, groundwater, interdisciplinary teams. I think that aspect of integrated management is going to be much tougher to bring into, the true sort of policy setting of government agencies working together across both local, state, and federal levels. But I know there's a lot of interest in kind of observation out there in the academic world, research going into that. So we'll kind of see where that goes, both water quantity, water quality. But yeah, I think in Nebraska we have a good system. I think it's taken time to get here to where it's kind of matured, but I think overall it's working well, and it relies on strong partnerships between the state and local NRDs and the stakeholders that are participating in those processes.
So I'll expand on that just a little bit. Jesse mentioned prior appropriation being kind of the law of the West, and the process in Nebraska being a little distinct from that. One thing that I will say in my observation is that the process itself, Nebraskans have access to that process. That's something that is not really or not widely available to individuals in many other states. So they've got those local NRD boards, and we all elect those, someone from our own neighborhood to be on that board. And we can keep track of those board meetings. We can go to those meetings and speak and influence those board members' perspectives about the decisions they need to make in the integrated water management process. And in many Western states, the state engineer's office administers according to prior appropriation. So do you want a water right? You can sign up for a new water right, but you're junior, you're going to be the first one shut off. And it's rigid, it's inflexible. It doesn't provide for adaptive management, to use a buzzword from a few years ago. So that is something that Nebraskans have that many other states don't have access to. My opinion, if we fail somewhere, it's that we don't go to those meetings and talk to those representatives. And when a board makes a decision that somebody doesn't like politically, then it's a big controversy, and we're in the paper and we're filing lawsuits and things like that. And some of that can be prevented if we show up regularly to those board meetings.
And I think just to tag into that, it's education too, to the end users, benefit. We got to be able to teach about the tools and the ways out there to help manage this, and what's available to a grower, to you, to whomever, our municipalities, to help make this sustainable long term.
So starting with Amy, what do you see as the role of farmers in water conservation?
Well, considering farmers, as a general rule around the world, use 70% of the water that's available. Think about that, 70% of the water that's available. That's a lot of water day in and day out. And if you've ever driven up and down the interstate during the summer, through central Nebraska and watched all the center pivots running, you probably have questioned whether that's even close to being accurate. But with that being said, there are so many tools that are available to growers out there to help them manage what they have. From very simplistic soil moisture probes to very complex ground penetrating radar that actually goes on a center pivot and moves with that pivot. It's about educating them and helping them manage every drop on every acre and making sure that timing is correct. We've learned through varieties and the changes through science that what we grow is just easier to grow these days. It requires less products. requires less water in some instances, but it's all about timing and making sure that it's applied at the appropriate time, at the appropriate place. And so, it's about moving forward and educating and helping growers really understand what they're doing. I think all of them want to be sustainable. They just don't necessarily know how or don't realize that they are doing really great things long term. And it's just about keeping them, promoting them. Again, going back to what Doug said about, encouraging him to go to the NRD meetings, because that's where a lot of their consumption restrictions come from. The Twin Platte Natural Resource District, which would be west of here, Lexington to basically Ogallala, north and south off the interstate. They just implemented water restrictions, but it was voluntary, all grower based. They had 100% participation when push came to shove at the end of the time frame to bring those restrictions on. They're using a company out of Texas called Grower Information Services to help manage through an app on their phone what they're using every day, every season of that growing cycle. And so it's pretty cool to be able to say that those growers actually got to choose what their water restrictions are versus some of the other NRDs, and I'm not knocking any of them, but some of them, it came down to a board decision in a meeting, and they said, okay, this looks good, this is what we're going to do. So are some of the growers upset by them? Absolutely. Twin Platte, every grower got to have a say in that and voluntarily step up and help conserve.
Yeah, and I think, I kind of think of it as, people like me, we come to those discussions and integrated management planning discussions about and talk about what's possible. But I think producers tell us what's reasonable. We come to those conversations thinking about, okay, we got these problems, we got to find solutions, we can put out potential solutions, and I think the producers really play a key role in helping us figure out what's reasonable. I think they play a key role in participating in those boards at the NRD level. And then I think ultimately, those plans will, like Amy was saying, they'll contain controls. Those controls are really constructed with producer input. I mean, we're trying to create controls that have the right amount of flexibility, but again, making sure we hit the outcome we need to. And then I also wanted to just hit on, the project Amy was just mentioning about in the Twin Platte NRD. I mean, that's another great example where producers are voluntarily signing up. Our objective is to try to reduce average consumptive use by about 1 inch an acre. That's what we're trying to do. And so we're trying to equip producers with tools. That came directly out of stakeholder conversations of what people wanted to see happen in that NRD. So the state, the NRD, we've invested millions of dollars and making sure that producers will have access to those tools. And that's not the only area we're doing that in. I mean, we're working with Amy and the Water Balance Alliance and the Upper Republican NRD. Again, we're trying to equip producers with real-time ET information in that instance so they can make decisions about application of water. Because in a lot of our instances, that 1 inch can be a big difference. If we can get that 1 inch, one less time around on the pivot, that can make the difference. And so we've been investing probably close to $10 million over the last 5 years in both the project in the Twin Platte NRD and telemetry meter data across almost the entire Republican River Basin. We're going to be getting there. North Platte NRD. So there's a lot of investment in those producer tools. Soil moisture probes are another big one. So I think those types of investments are going to become more and more important. And with technology changing so fast at the producer level, I think it's critical that they play a role in helping us craft both the kind of the controls, if we have to use controls, or incentives that we're trying to get out there so that those are effective.
So for those of you that don't think 1 inch is a lot of water, let me put that into perspective. So on a center pivot that's on a quarter section, so a quarter mile or a half mile by a half mile, that is almost 20, it depends on how big the pivot is, but about 25 million gallons of water that we're saving just by not rotating that pivot once. So 1 inch is actually really a lot of water when it comes down to it.
I'll just point out that this is, farmer's role is multi-layered also. We've heard a lot about kind of the seasonal planning, and the next integrated management plans have a 50-year planning window that's kind of built into the analysis that they do. Farmers that engage in this process also learn more conceptually about the system as you go through this process, and then they can start looking even beyond that 50-year window to their succession planning. What's the next generation's farm going to look like? How are they going to have to adapt? What are the grandchildren going to do with the farm 100 years from now? So engaging in the process is a value to farmers and adds to that conceptual understanding of what's happening on the ground and on their ground.
If you haven't had the chance, read 40 Chances by Warren Buffett. It's a really good book that gives a farmer's perspective on just exactly what Doug said about succession planning and looking forward to the future and how that's going to look long term.
Yeah, I was thinking about something related to that topic. What do you think the shrinking rural population and increasing incidence of absentee landowners will do in the way that we manage water?
They're both looking at me. I can feel the death stares. So that's real. I mean, truly, absentee landowners is a really true big deal. We have a neighbor that cash rents several pieces, the landowners in California. And as you know, politics in California are very different than they are here. And so it's very interesting to watch and see what pressures they do put upon them. I think, again, it goes back to telling our story and talking about who we are and how we move forward in telling that story. There's no right or wrong answer. Unfortunately, politics will always persuade how growers, farm day in and day out. Whether it's something as simple as the absentee landowner or it's something much more high pressure like the NRD putting in water restrictions. But it's about having conversations, and I think both Jesse and I have alluded to, there's tools out there, soil moisture probes, ground penetrating radar, all kinds of things that are available to a grower to help prove that they really are not using the water that it appears that we are using.
My first impression or reaction to the question is that it kind of depends on what kind of political influence those absentee landowners have. And I might suggest that local farmers who are engaged in that local process of management, engaged with their NRD, have the advantage to adapt their management through time in the way that best fits their operations.
Yeah, I think what you've been hearing us say, right? This is a participatory process, right? We need people to be engaged in it for it to work effectively. So that would be a concern. If we start to lose that engagement, which I'm not saying that just inherently happens because of absentee, owners, but we have to have people engaged in this process. You can see the passion that Amy talks about this, right? As it affects her farm. That's what we want in this process because we need that type of input to make the best management decisions.
I think too, a lot of what we see for absentee landowners are not necessarily ones that live afar, but rather they're women, older women, oftentimes in their late 80s and early 90s, that just don't get how we farm these days. They grew up farming. They were part of that generation where everybody was connected to a farm. But very old school. They did things very differently, and so they oftentimes don't understand technology and how to make it integrate into a system, and are very reluctant into allowing the tenant to be able to use those type of technologies. So it just depends on who it is and where it is and how far away they are.
I'm going to step away a moment from philosophical questions, which have been great in terms of getting my brain going, but when do I have the opportunity to ask the question of a couple of trained hydrogeologists and also an on-the-ground hydrogeologist? As a new resident of the Central Platte River Valley, I've been very curious about the groundwater and surface water connection in the river, and I think especially because we sort of anticipated that as irrigation season was winding down, we would probably see water come back to the river. And that has not really been the case, at least where I'm at in Grand Island. And so I'm curious about your thoughts, your perspectives, your experiences, and if just any explanation you have for why we're not seeing water in the river at this time.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start. I mean, it's unique. It's a unique system, right? I mean, if you think back and you look back 100 years ago, I mean, I've, you know, as we've been looking at the South Platte Compact and looking back at, 100-year-old hydrologic investigations, I mean, there were hydrographers coming down to Kearney, and there was no flow in the Platte River. Zero. Every year they came down here. They came down to look. There's no flow below Kearney. So I kind of look at it from the flip side of that, like, wow, isn't it amazing that we've developed this system and we've been able to now have reliable flows through the Central Platte in most years. Now this year, yeah, it's been a rough year, and we do certainly hope to see the river recover. And I think it's interesting because you do see in the lower Platte, kind of, we were watching more the Ashland area, kind of in the lower Platte, because Omaha and Lincoln's well fields are down in that area. But you do see how much that part of the river has recovered. 1,000 CFS of recovery is a lot of water to come back into the system after irrigation season started to wrap up. So, we hope to see that recovery in the Central Platte, but it's not uncharacteristic for that stretch to remain dry for quite a while. And if you look back really, like I said, in the longer history, it just really didn't have water in it most of the time. So I don't know, I'll let Doug or others chime in, but I think it's just kind of interesting how we've changed this system so much over the last 100 years. There certainly is the bad, but there's also good. I mean, it's just, I think, your perspective and kind of where your starting point on that is.
So Jesse's absolutely right about the changes in the Platte system. And I'm going to go back to my sheet of paper model. And that sheet of sediment is essentially a very, very large alluvial fan that comes off the Rocky Mountains. And alluvial fans are characterized by large pulse flows that move sediment into a wedge at the base or a change in slope. And we have this wedge of sediment that's a long ways from east to west. And in a purely gaining system, that is a stream that has more flow as you move further downstream and a relatively even base flow distribution along its length, your mental model of turn the pumps off, flow comes back to the river works. The problem with the Platte system is that's not how the Platte works. It's not a uniformly gaining system. It loses water, particularly and notably where the South Platte River comes off of the White River Group strata and onto High Plains Aquifer material. And Julesburg gauge routinely has much more flow than the Roscoe, Nebraska gauge. So where that water's largely going into the ground. So we have a losing reach there. And if you look at some of the historic maps that go back to the early 20th century, it was well known that below North Platte is where those reaches started losing. So the Platte main stem below North Platte was kind of the beginning of a losing reach, and how far that water gets in the absence of canals and diversions and return flows is an annual question, right? So I think that has something to do with it. I think there's still some questions, unanswered questions about the spatial and temporal relationships of stream and groundwater interaction. And that's actually what my main research out in North Platte it focuses on, is making those observations.
So I'm going to give you the boots on the ground report.
Yeah.
They give you the technical stuff. I'm going to tell you right now, we were still irrigating the first week in October. So water doesn't just magically regenerate itself overnight. With that being said, why were we irrigating so late? Normally we're done mid-September, give or take a little bit. This year, with the hail that we had the first part of June, we ended up with a lot of acres in this part of the state that were replanted, which put us the better part of 6 weeks behind a normal growing season. So we were still having to irrigate and make sure that, or attempt to make sure that that crop got to maturity before it froze. So with that being said, I left my poor husband at home this afternoon to pick up irrigation pipe by himself. So we're still at that point. We're looking at Halloween here, right? And normally by Halloween, we're done with harvest. I mean, it's like, let's celebrate who we're at that, light at the end of the tunnel. Not this year. We're not even close. If we're done by Thanksgiving, it might be the reality. So with that being said, where we were still irrigating that late, that water has just not had a chance to replenish itself yet.
I like Amy's answer better.
Thank you all.
Okay, I have one. What is your experience with barriers to communication about groundwater, and across professionals from different sectors, but also this has been a very Nebraska-centric panel, and we've got folks here from other states as well. So if you can or feel comfortable doing so across the basin, across state boundaries, even NRD boundaries or farm boundaries, what have you perceived as being barriers to communication about groundwater?
I mean, one of the most difficult challenges I think for us, you can't measure a groundwater depletion, right? I mean, it's a condition where you're trying to assess how much more water would have been in the stream without a well. Well, the only way you would be able to measure that is to have that exact same set of facts occur with and without that well. So it's virtually impossible to measure that outcome. So we have to rely a lot on things like groundwater models. And that's the black box, right? That's the hocus pocus to a lot of folks. But, I always try to remind people it's based on two fundamental laws of science, the law of conservation of mass and Darcy's law, which as a hydrogeologist would know is a principal law of hydrogeology. In other words, if you consume something, it's out of that system. And then Darcy's law just allows us to understand, based on it being removed, how did that affect what would have otherwise moved through that system? So those are complex though, right? I mean, even to scientists who's not familiar with Darcy's law, those can be real barriers to communication, understanding that. And when you can't just point to observational data of seed, cause, and effect, that can make communication really difficult. And
I'm a modeler, and I don't even want to use other people's models.
Yeah, exactly, right? So I think that's one, certainly. And then I think just, the typical barriers, understanding sort of the spatial and temporal issues associated with managing groundwater. I mean, these are things we're managing on timescales of decades or centuries, not days, like maybe surface water. So that can be a barrier, certainly. And the scale and scope of Nebraska's aquifers relative to a lot of other states and areas, we can have aquifers extending well outside of surface water drainages, wells that can affect streams across surface water drainages. So again, kind of those temporal and spatial issues, which are common in a lot of sciences, but really, I think, prominent issues in our work.
You're going to hear me do Pete and repeat a lot. Tell our story. It's about talking about what we do. I have a lot of very good friends across this country. And with that being said, a lot of them are big city folks. I have a very good friend that lives in Denver, and she's been really great about asking questions. She's like, send me video. I want to see what you guys do day in and day out as an operation. I want to understand more about where my food comes from and how it's grown and how it's produced, and tell me what I need to know or what I need to be educated on this. And growers just don't do a good story of what they do. And you'll find that my passion is education, and I want them to talk about who they are, what they do, and the really great things that come out of that year in and year out. And so with that being said, my best story of why we need to talk and tell stories, had a friend come in from just outside of LA, never stepped foot in rural America ever. She'd hardly ever been outside of the city. So she comes out here, spends some time with us. We were actually coming back from Lincoln. Very cold winter January day. So, it's barren, little snowpack out there. And she's like pointing out the car window, and she's like, what's that dinosaur out there? And we're like looking at each other going, what is she talking about? And we're like, we don't understand. She's like, well, I'll show you again. They're all over out here. Pretty soon, here she is again. That dinosaur. She was talking about a center pivot. It looks like dinosaur bones out there, if you really want to think about it. But that was her perception. She didn't know what it was. It was dinosaur bones out in the middle of the field. And then to explain to her how it works was a whole nother story. She could not understand that it was anchored at one point and moved around in a circle. That would just blew her mind. So it's about telling our story, as simplistic as it is about dinosaur bones out in the middle of our fields, to the complex whys of we do really great water management. It's about talking about who we are and what we do.
I think all of that is terrific. I'm going to take just a second here to poke the dinosaur in the room. Is that also, and those are dealing with kind of technical and sharing research and ideas and things like that. The dinosaur, one of the barriers that I see in discussing things with people in different states is, to the degree that anything is adversarial, then that is a distinct barrier to communication. Has anybody seen or heard a political ad lately? Our local senator, or one of the candidates for senator from District 42, is running an ad that he's going to fight those interests, those water interests in Colorado, and that's fine. But if we're going to effectively advocate for Nebraska and undermine Colorado's arguments, we can't certainly tell them everything we know about everything, right? So any sort of thing that relates to a quasi-adversarial process, or something where we stand to lose by sharing and communicating, that's going to be a significant barrier. And DNR's done a terrific job of telling their story. They're out engaging with producers and farmers and board members and NRDs and things. So I'm not minimizing the efforts of the state to share everything they can and be as transparent as they can, but there are some things that just simply are better not shared if we want to protect our own interests.
Yeah, I mean, I just to follow up on that, I mean, I think, lawsuits are barriers. They're major barriers. I mean, we've certainly found that out in spades in the Republican River Basin, that it took going through that process, unfortunately, for the states to really then sit down and say, hey, wait a minute, your producer's coming over to McCook and they're buying our stuff and they're going back over there and they're coming across Colorado state lines. This really should be about managing the water so that it's working for the region. And I think that's what we did, post lawsuits, is we sat down over several years and started to develop management approaches that were focused on how do we help our water users. We still have to all, as states, protect our entitlements to water, but let's do it in a way that makes sense so that we're not just kind of blindly following procedures without really thinking about those outcomes.
It is 4 o'clock. Does anyone have an absolute burning question they have to get off their chest or they'll explode? Okay, I have one less burning question that I need to ask or I will explode. So, last question. In light of the fact that a lot of human activities require very consistent water availability and a lot of habitat, as we've seen throughout the day, different talks, a lot of habitat requires variance, specifically in flows. So in light of that, what do you observe about the role of groundwater and habitat from season to season, during floods, during droughts? Where do you see that going?
I'm going to go to my paper model and say it's all connected. We're all dependent on the same water, and it's no more important, more or less important to one constituency than the other.
Yeah, and I just, again, you mentioned groundwater, right? That's our stable component of flow. Things we've been trying to do over the last decade is try to grab more from those high flow periods, right? Put it into our aquifers so then it's there during these drought periods. Make ourselves more resilient from a water stability standpoint. But that gets to be a challenge, right? When you're managing wildlife management goals, maybe they want to see those peak flows. They're important for moving sediments. Maybe they're the cue for a fish spawn, whatever it is, those can become very important. But you got to balance those because last time I checked, fish don't do well without water either, right? So, there's sort of just got to be discussion on what those management goals are, balancing those, and then, implementing and then adapting as I think we've been talking about.
So I can't believe somebody hasn't asked about the crane migration yet and how that fits into a habitat in water. So this part of the state is certainly home to millions of sandhill cranes and a few whooping cranes that do manage to stop on their way through to Canada. And so from a grower's perspective, we despise them. They're a nuisance.
Panel's over.
I'm sorry.
We're done.
The
We're done. Have a great day.
the cranes are not a nuisance. The people that come with them are the nuisance. But we understand that it's part of tourism. With that being said, I appreciate the grasslands that have been set aside for them to roost, but actually they don't like the grass. They like to be out in the stubble fields of corn and soybeans, mostly corn, because they can see the predators, guys. So with that being said, we end up with a lot of them on our stubble field. And so, we try and leave protection there for them. We don't come through and till that soil, multitude of reasons, but part of it is for them. It also helps conserve the moisture in that profile for spring on any snowpack or rain that we might get through the fall, winter, and early spring. So with that being said, we truly want to be able to preserve for all animals, whether they're big or small, swim, fly, whatever it is. We really want to make sure that there is an environment out there for them. It's about that ecosystem and maintaining that balance.
All right. Thank you, everybody who joined the panel. Thank you guys for being here. Can we give our panelists a round of applause?